December 1969. The Ryman Auditorium, Nashville. Johnny Cash was halfway through Folsom Prison Blues, the crowd singing every word, when something impossible happened. The back doors opened, flooding the dark venue with blinding hallway light, and a figure stepped through that made
Good
Johnny's
evening,
voice catch
ladies and
mid-verse.
gentlemen.
Elvis Presley, the king himself, stood silhouetted
Are we ready
in the
to
doorway,
rock?
alone.
Yes,
No bodyguards, no entourage, no war.
Then let's get
He
it
wasn't
on.
supposed to be here. Nobody had invited him. He'd simply shown up, drawn by something he couldn't name, to watch the man who'd once been his peer but had somehow remained authentic, while Elvis had become a prisoner of his own fame. The music stopped instantly. Not a gradual fade, a complete, shocked silence as every musician on stage recognized who had just walked in. And what happened in the next 30 minutes would reveal a truth about fame, friendship, and the cost of becoming a legend that neither man had ever spoken aloud. Before we step into that moment when two legends collided in the most unexpected way, tell me, what city are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments, because this story about respect, rivalry, and the loneliness of being at the top is something that transcends music and geography. Here's the question that'll haunt you. If someone who'd achieved everything you dreamed of showed up to watch you perform, would it inspire you or terrify you? Would you see it as validation or competition? Johnny Cash faced exactly that situation when Elvis Presley walked through those doors, and his response would define the relationship between two men who'd started in the same place but traveled very different roads to the same destination. Immortality at the cost of everything else. If this story moves you, hit that subscribe button. We're about to witness the most electric 30 minutes in country music history. To understand why Elvis's unexpected appearance stopped Johnny's show cold, you need to understand where both men were in December 1969. Johnny was experiencing a career renaissance. His live album, At Folsom Prison, had become a massive crossover hit. His ABC television variety show was dominating ratings, and he just married June Carter, finally achieving the personal stability that had eluded him through years of addiction. He was sober, successful, creatively vital, performing music that mattered to him rather than chasing commercial trends. He was, in short, exactly where he wanted to be professionally and personally. Elvis, by contrast, was drowning in a golden cage of his own construction. The late 60s had been brutal for Elvis. Years wasted making terrible movies with forgettable soundtracks had eroded his artistic credibility. His 1968 comeback special had reminded the world of his talent, but Colonel Tom Parker had immediately steered him toward Vegas residencies that were lucrative but artistically suffocating. Elvis was performing the same set list twice a night to crowds who wanted the greatest hits and the jumpsuit spectacle, not the raw rock and roll or gospel music that still stirred his soul. He was the biggest star in the world and profoundly miserable, watching contemporaries like Johnny Cash create meaningful work while he was trapped in a cycle of performance and pills that was slowly killing him. So when Elvis heard that Johnny was performing at the Ryman Auditorium, the mother church of country music, something in him broke, and he made a decision that terrified his handlers. He'd go alone. No Colonel Parker telling him where to stand and what to say. No bodyguards creating barriers between him and reality. No advance notice that would turn the evening into a media circus. Just Elvis, slipping out of his hotel through a service entrance, driving himself to the Ryman in a borrowed car, buying a ticket from a scalper outside the venue, and walking through those back doors like any other fan desperate to see Johnny Cash perform. The decision was reckless and liberating in equal measure, the first genuinely spontaneous thing Elvis had done in years. But when those doors opened and light flooded into the dark auditorium, when every head turned to see who'd interrupted the show, Elvis's anonymity evaporated instantly. Johnny Cash stood frozen at the microphone, his guitar hanging silent, staring at the figure backlit in the doorway. The band had stopped playing reflexively, following Johnny's lead without knowing why. The audience was confused at first. Some were annoyed at the interruption. Others were craning their necks to see what had caused the music to stop. Then someone near the back recognized Elvis, and the recognition spread through the crowd like electricity. Whispers becoming gasps, becoming shouts of, "That's Elvis," and "The King is here." The energy in the room transformed completely. excitement mixing with uncertainty about what was supposed to happen next. Because this wasn't planned, this wasn't a surprise guest appearance with rehearsed banter and coordinated logistics. This was chaos, pure and spontaneous. Elvis stood in the doorway, suddenly aware that his impulsive decision had created a situation he hadn't thought through. He'd wanted to watch Johnny perform, to see what authentic artistry looked like, to remind himself that music could still be pure instead of just product. But he'd forgotten or hadn't fully internalized that Elvis Presley couldn't just show up places without consequences. His presence didn't just add to an event, it transformed it completely, made it about him whether he wanted that or not. He saw Johnny frozen on stage, saw the band standing awkwardly, saw the crowd starting to turn away from the performance to focus on him, and realized he'd just ruined the exact thing he'd come to experience. The moment stretched unbearably, neither man knowing what came next, until Johnny Cash did something that revealed everything about who he was. He smiled. Not a performative show business smile, but a genuine expression of welcome mixed with amusement at the absurdity of the situation. Then he spoke into the microphone, his voice carrying that distinctive authority that made everything he said sound like truth. Well, I'll be damned. Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis Presley just walked into my show. Elvis, you planning to stand in the doorway all night, or you going to come down here and sing something? The challenge was gentle but clear, and the crowd erupted in applause and shouts. Understanding that something extraordinary was happening, that the script had been thrown out, and they were about to witness something unrehearsed and real. Elvis hesitated for maybe 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours, before starting down the aisle toward the stage. The walk to the stage was the longest of Elvis's life. Every eye in the Ryman Auditorium was on him, tracking his progress through the crowd. People reached out to touch him as he passed, and he shook hands reflexively, smiled at faces he'd never see again, moved through the crowd with practiced ease that disguised his internal panic. He hadn't performed with other artists spontaneously in years. Every collaboration, every duet, every guest appearance was carefully choreographed and rehearsed. The idea of just walking on stage and singing with Johnny Cash, no rehearsal, no set list, no plan, was terrifying in a way that Vegas performances with their predictable structure never were. But it was also the most alive he'd felt in months, maybe years. When Elvis reached the stage, Johnny extended his hand and pulled him up. They stood face to face for a moment, two legends who'd started at Sun Records in the same era, but had taken wildly different paths since. Johnny lean and weathered in his signature black, Elvis softer around the edges, wearing casual clothes that made him look more human than the jumpsuits allowed. They'd known each other for over a decade, but hadn't really talked in years. Their lives had diverged too completely for casual friendship. But in this moment, standing on the Ryman stage with 1,000 people watching and no script to follow, they connected through the one language they both spoke fluently: music. "What do you want to sing?" Johnny asked quietly, off mic, giving Elvis the choice. Elvis's answer revealed everything about what he'd been missing, what had driven him to show up uninvited. Gospel, something real. Not a performance, just music. Johnny nodded like he'd been expecting exactly that answer, like he understood that Elvis was starving for authenticity in a life that had become entirely performative. He turned to his band and called out a song that every Southern boy raised in church knew by heart: "Peace in the Valley." The musicians nodded, found their positions, and when the first notes rang out through the Ryman, Elvis closed his eyes and started singing with a purity and sincerity that Vegas audiences never heard. This wasn't Elvis the showman. This was Elvis the believer, the mama's boy from Tupelo who'd learned to sing in Pentecostal churches before fame complicated everything. Johnny joined on harmony, his deep voice grounding Elvis's soaring tenor, and together they created something that transcended both their individual talents. The audience sat in stunned silence, understanding they were witnessing something rare and unrepeatable. Two legends stripped of their mythologies, just singing gospel music because it fed something in their souls that fame had been slowly starving. When "Peace in the Valley" ended, there was a beat of profound silence before the applause crashed over them like a wave. But Elvis and Johnny barely noticed. They were already launching into the next song, then the next, trading verses and harmonies, teaching each other songs the other didn't know. For 30 minutes, the show became something nobody had paid for but everyone needed. An impromptu gospel revival led by the king of rock and roll and the man in black. Two men reconnecting with the faith and music that had shaped them before the industry reshaped them into products. They sang I'll Fly Away and Just a Closer Walk with Thee and Where Could I Go But to the Lord? Songs that required no rehearsal because they lived in the bones of anyone raised in southern churches. Elvis's voice was stronger than it had been in years, freed from the constraint of Vegas arrangements and audience expectations. Johnny sang like he was in church, not performing but worshipping, using music to access something larger than himself. And the Ryman Auditorium, the mother church of country music, became an actual church for those 30 minutes, hosting a service led by accidental ministers. When they finally stopped, when the spontaneous set reached its natural conclusion, Elvis and Johnny stood side by side, both slightly out of breath, both grinning with the satisfaction of having done something purely for the joy of doing it, rather than for commercial reasons. The audience gave them a standing ovation that lasted 5 full minutes, but more importantly, the two men on stage had given each other something more valuable than applause: recognition. Johnny had shown Elvis that authentic artistry was still possible, that you could be successful without selling your soul. Elvis had reminded Johnny that the pressure of being a legend was real and crushing, that maintaining authenticity required constant vigilance and courage. Neither said these things out loud, but both understood them through the music they'd just shared. Elvis left the way he'd come, through the back door alone, slipping away before the crowd could mob him or the moment could be commercialized into something it wasn't. Johnny returned to his scheduled set, performing the songs people had paid to hear. But the energy had changed. The spontaneous 30 minutes with Elvis had injected genuine magic into what would have been just another excellent Johnny Cash concert. People who were there would talk about it for the rest of their lives, would tell their children and grandchildren about the night Elvis Presley crashed Johnny Cash's show, and both men became human again for 30 minutes. But the real impact wasn't on the audience, it was on Elvis and Johnny themselves. Elvis died 8 years later in August 1977, his body destroyed by prescription drugs, and a life he couldn't control. At the funeral, Johnny Cash was there, and he couldn't stop thinking about that December night at the Ryman, the last time he'd seen Elvis genuinely happy and free. In interviews afterward, Johnny would reference it obliquely. I saw Elvis at his best one time, and it wasn't on stage in Vegas or in his movies. It was when he showed up uninvited to my show and we just sang gospel for the pure joy of singing it. That was the real Elvis, the one the world didn't get to see enough. The story of Elvis crashing Johnny's show became legendary, though the details were often wrong in retellings. Some versions had them singing for hours, others claimed it was a planned publicity stunt. But the people who were actually there knew the truth. It was spontaneous, unrehearsed, driven by Elvis's desperate need for something real in a life that had become performance all the way down. And Johnny had given him that gift, had welcomed him on stage without hesitation, had created space for Elvis to just be a singer again instead of being Elvis Presley TM. That generosity, that understanding of what Elvis needed even before Elvis fully understood it himself, defined the relationship between them. Mutual respect between two men who'd climbed the same mountain from different sides and understood the cost of the view from the top. The music industry tried to recreate that magic. Promoters approached both artists about a formal collaboration, a gospel album or tour. But both Elvis and Johnny declined, understanding that what happened at the Ryman couldn't be manufactured or repeated. It had worked precisely because it wasn't planned, because it came from genuine need rather than commercial calculation. Trying to recreate it would have killed what made it sacred, so they let it remain a single perfect moment, a reminder that sometimes the best art happens when you throw away the script and just trust the music to carry you. Johnny Cash carried the memory of that night for the rest of his life, brought it out whenever he needed, reminding that fame and authenticity could coexist if you fought hard enough to maintain both. And in his final years, when he was recording the American recordings series that would define his artistic legacy, he'd think about Elvis walking through those doors at the Ryman, the courage it took to show up vulnerable and unannounced, the hunger for something real that drove the king to step off his throne for 30 minutes. The lesson wasn't lost on Johnny. The moments that matter most are the ones you can't plan. The connections that feed your soul are the ones that happen when you stop performing and start being human. Elvis walked into Johnny Cash's show uninvited, and the music stopped instantly. But in that silence before they started singing together, in that moment of uncertainty and possibility, something profound happened. Two legends remembered they were also just people, and people need connection more than they need applause. The 30 minutes that followed proved that the best art comes from letting go of control and trusting that authenticity will resonate more deeply than any calculated performance ever could. That's what the industry forgets, and what Elvis and Johnny remembered that December night. Music is supposed to be about truth, not product. And sometimes the truest moment in a performer's career is the one that happens completely off script, when legend becomes human and human becomes holy, through the simple act of singing together. Claude é uma IA e pode cometer erros. Por favor, verifique as respostas.